New York City has the largest stock of public housing in the country. There is currently a bad faith attempt by the manager of New York City Public Housing, NYCHA, and NYCHA CEO Gregg Russ to privatize a significant number of these units, which would permanently eliminate thousands of the last affordable housing units in New York City and put hundreds of thousands of working class black and brown people at risk of homelessness. This is how we got here and how you can fight back.
Public housing was officially created by the National Housing Act in 1934. Its primary goal was to ensure, quote, that our nation should promote the goal of providing decent and affordable housing for all citizens in order, quote, to remedy the acute shortages of decent and safe dwellings for low-income families. Months after the passage of the National Housing Act, NYCHA was founded, and the first public housing development was built in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Of course, the legislation wasn't perfect, but for decades, public housing was the most desirable housing in the country, private or public. The 1980s, under the Reagan administration, introduced the era of divestment. HUD's budget is slashed to under $40 billion, a decrease of more than 50% from 1976.
Reagan is successful in disseminating the racist stereotype that people in public housing were taking advantage of the subsidies leeching off the government. In the 1990s, the Fair Cloth Amendment is introduced, which makes it illegal to build any additional public housing unless you demolish existing public housing. This makes it almost impossible to provide any additional federal housing for low-income people. For the last 4 decades, federal disinvestment has dramatically worsened the conditions of public housing. Since 2001, NYCHA has suffered more than $2.7 billion in cuts from the federal government. In 2021, this is what over 600,000 NYCHA tenants live in today.
Due to the embarrassment over the state of public housing, NYCHA has released various plans over the years with goals to improve public housing. They've been called Next Gen, NYCHA 2.0, RAD, Infill, and the latest plan is called the Blueprint. However, none of these have actually invested in the lives of tenants, and they are all different versions of privatization. The Blueprint is being pushed by NYCHA's new CEO, Gregg Russ. Gregg has a long history of privatization.
Russ's track record of dismantling public housing begins in Detroit in 1995. Russ intervened in Detroit in order to remove the housing agency from HUD's troubled agency list. In 1995, Detroit had 9,007 available public housing units. After Detroit, Russ became the chief of staff at the Chicago Housing Authority in 1997. During his time in Chicago, Russ created and signed the Plan for Transformation, which displaced 17,000 people. After dismantling Chicago's public housing, Russ moved on to Cambridge in 2004. In Cambridge, Russ privatized every single unit of public housing under the RAD program, ending public housing in Cambridge. Following the mass privatization of Cambridge's public housing, Russ was hand-selected by the city of Minneapolis in 2017 to end public housing. Russ put an end to public housing in Minneapolis and displaced over 15,000 low-income black and brown tenants and made sure that the 40,000 people on the wait list for public housing could never have access.
To make it worse, Gregg Russ's family is one of the largest owners of federally subsidized low-income housing tax credit properties in Minnesota, with similar investments in other states. This means that Gregg is personally getting richer while he ruins the lives of literally tens of thousands of public housing tenants. Even though various newspapers called out this blatant conflict of interest and corruption, Minneapolis City Hall was complicit and ignored this ethical violation. That is why Gregg is called the czar of privatization and gentrification. Now that Gregg has been sent to New York City to privatize NYCHA, he has created the blueprint.
This is a set of ideas designed to invest billions of dollars of capital back into the apartments and fix many of the issues that have confronted residents for years and years.
This bill will affect, in one way or another, all 600,000 plus NYCHA public housing tenants in New York City, as they are closest to the pain, the everyday challenge of living with NYCHA as a landlord. Gregg Russ says that he has done a significant outreach to the tenants. However, when pressed on the issue, he proudly said he reached out to over 2,000 tenants. This is less than 0.3% of tenants.
You mentioned how many people you did reach out to, and I believe that number was around 1,000, correct?
That's through the town halls only.
Mm-hmm. And so that's like a percentage of a percentage, right? That's like, I mean, we have 600,000 people in the portfolio.
This outreach was done in the middle of the pandemic, when public housing residents were being hit harder than any other resident in the city.
I think a lot of people know about it. In the middle of this global pandemic, a lot of our residents are under extreme financial and emotional stress, and many people are not aware of the plan, let alone given enough time to read and understand it. I myself was only given the plan and the PowerPoint that you guys presented to me just 2 weeks ago on the 23rd.
And for a while, Gregg would only release vague, wishy-washy information about the blueprint. Then, without warning, the full text of the bill was announced with only 7 days until a public hearing. The few tenants who knew about the blueprint scrambled to read the dense legal text, trying to become experts in 7 days. Then, to make it even worse, only 13 tenants were allowed to give testimony at the public hearing. But damned if those 13 tenants didn't give Gregg Russ a piece of their mind.
Tenants were given 7 days to register for this hearing. The methods of registration for some are avenues they don't have access to or know how to navigate. And our elected officials received this presentation and proposal 2 weeks ago and some yesterday. So even they didn't have ample time to communicate with their constituencies about this plan. Introducing the blueprint in the middle of a global pandemic and economic crisis shows how much you value NYCHA tenants.
We do not have an official statement from CCOP, no.
The Citywide Council of Presidents do not agree with the blueprint plan for change.
Gregg knows that New York City has a strong, progressive force and will not respond well to privatization. So he is trying to be tricky by creating something called a public trust. Essentially, it sells bonds of the public trust to huge banks like Chase, Bank of America, and Goldman Sachs, which will likely force increased rents in order to pay off the bondholders, indebting the most vulnerable people in New York City. Charles Barron, a lifelong fighter for working class people and Black and brown communities, sums it up well.
You shouldn't trust it, and it's not going to be public. It's their way of privatizing, just putting a different label on it.
NYCHA has so frequently and still speaks of strong partners and partnerships with stakeholders, but have not been truly accountable and transparent with the true stakeholders, which are the residents of public housing, those who live and reside in these properties.
I am enraged by the greed, the audacity, and the laziness demonstrated by elected officials at the city, state, and congressional level, NYCHA leadership, and many community organizations that claim to fight for NYCHA tenants, but are not holding our best interests at heart. As a result of your lack of vision and boldness, we are now discussing a plan that leads to the destruction of public housing in New York City.
Not one more poorly thought out policy that puts profit, real estate over people.
The last reason that Gregg says we need to pass the blueprint is because there is no alternative. Oh, Gregg, don't you get tired of lying? There is an alternative, and it's called the Green New Deal for Public Housing.
The Green New Deal for Public Housing Act would be the most significant investment in public housing since its creation in 1934. This act would mean investing, retrofitting, and decarbonizing the entire public housing stock of the country. With over $120 billion of federal investment over 10 years, it will be possible to decarbonize more than 1 million units of the country's public housing stock, the equivalent of taking 1.2 million cars off the road every year. Over 10 years, that is the equivalent of removing all the cars from New York and Florida combined. These same retrofits would eliminate lead, mold, and other health hazards that plague the nearly 2 million people who live in America's public housing. All this would create over 240,000 good quality jobs per year while building political support for more climate action. If you care about solving the climate crisis, the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act is a perfect place to start because the government already owns the buildings and they are in desperate need of maintenance already. This bill has already been introduced to Congress by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Bernie Sanders. And with the power of the Public Housing Tenants, Movement School, and Sunrise Movement NYC, we are fighting for a plan that puts people over profit and invests in the long-term dignity of every New Yorker. Now that we have a Democratic Congress and a Democratic presidency, this bill has a real possibility, but we need Biden and Congress to prioritize public housing and pass this bill.
How can you help? If you are a New York resident, call your state assembly member or senator and demand that they vote no on the blueprint. For everyone, including New York residents, call your federal Congress member and senator and demand that they vote yes on the Green New Deal for public housing.
For more information or to get involved in the fight, you can go to gnd4ph.com or follow Sunrise NYC and Movement School on socials.